grappling with a big transition from the industrial age to the internet or technology age. But this isn't the first time America has made a transition like this. I know you look at all sorts of things for your program, but have you thought at all about this transition and what it looks like from a historical perspective?
Well, from a historical perspective, we've always been both entranced by and also fearful of new technology replacing jobs. So the idea that automation or industrialization could take jobs away from human workers has always been a sort of rising concern as early as the late 18th century. I know that most people are familiar with the phrase Luddite, meaning someone who's sort of anti-technology, someone who doesn't appreciate automation or appreciate new technological innovations. But actually that phrase comes from a movement that started in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th century of textile workers who were fearful that new types of machines would take away their labor, and as a form of labor protest actually would destroy machines. So it wasn't that they were inherently against technology, it was that they were fearful of the idea that technology could replace workers. And at different points in time, the idea that new machinery or automation could replace a worker has always been a concern, but we've also been equally entranced by the idea of new technology and new innovations. One of my favorite things from our episode on Why Are There Few Women in STEM was when we discussed the idea of software programming and the innovations of software programming in the mid-20th century. And this was considered to be a kind of secretarial labor that people thought wasn't going to take off, wasn't going to be this huge innovation, and was therefore gendered as being extremely female, that it was something that would be sort of relegated to low-paid labor. But as we know now, computer programming and software programming has become sort of the thing that most people want to get into, or coding. So there's a way that these fluctuations in history have always been sort of, should we fold to new technology, should we embrace new technology, or should we run away from it?
That sets us up from a historical perspective, Gbenga. You tell me, in this debate about automation versus trade that we started to see at the presidential debate last week, you tell me, which one do you think is having the major impact?
So what we see a lot of times is that when we're talking about manufacturing, there's been a huge decrease in manufacturing starting from the 70s all the way now to the current period. And so a lot of people like to use automation as kind of the excuse of what's driving a huge amount. There was actually a study done in 2015 that said 80% of manufacturing employment was due to automation. Now that study's been debunked recently, and talking about more about trade, issues in trade. So in the early 2000s, China joined the World Trade Organization, and so they were able to be engaged in more free trade, and that had an impact. During the 2000s, there was also the strong dollar, which made exports more expensive. And so there's a number of factors that went into that it's not just about automation or automation versus trade, but it's a number of factors that impacted manufacturing employment.
But is there anything that's different about this transition? Because it certainly feels that way. I mean, when Andrew Yang makes the point that you walk into a McDonald's now and there's a kiosk there that you punch your code into instead of talking to a worker, or you go to a grocery store and you're checking your own bags out, and instead of talking to a grocery store worker, you know, we don't have elevator operators anymore, right? That was the old school thing that used to happen. But it feels like there's something different about this one because it's happening in so many sectors all at the same time. Is it not, Gbenga?
It's not, because if you look at it, a lot of people say that, oh, well, the issue here is that it's happening faster. But not really. As you said, we did have elevator operators. I always like to think about the milkman and what happened with refrigeration. These are things that always happen. And I think the problem in the discussion is that we talk about it in terms of aggregate job loss. And I think the way we need to think about it is, how does it change the nature of work? So a good example is when ATMs came about in the 90s. Everyone said, oh, well, that's going to kill bank teller industry. But what the data showed is that the number of bank tellers actually didn't drop and actually increased a little bit. And the reason why is that when ATMs came about, what it did is it made it cheaper for banks to actually open branches. So each individual branch had less tellers, but we opened more branches, which we need tellers. And then what changed was the nature of the teller's job. So they needed more interpersonal skills, marketing skills. And so people still go to the bank, but they go to the bank for different reasons, not to withdraw money. And so that's the way we need to think about automation.
One of the things, you tell me if I'm wrong here, but it feels like, from what I've read, when we started the transformation in household appliances, dishwashers, washing machines, all the things that kind of simplified or made easier housework, we kind of liberated a whole other part of the American workforce. Women who were staying at home were now able to get into the economy as well.
So in some ways that's true, and in others, the way that those products were marketed actually had a kind of converse effect. So in one way, the idea that we're bringing new technology into the home that makes domestic labor much easier, washing machines, dishwashers, vacuum cleaners, actually decrease the amount of hours, or was supposed to decrease the amount of hours that you spent actually doing this kind of labor in the home. But if you look back to those early advertisements and the ways that those were marketed towards women, specifically towards women who were primary caregivers or spend most of their time in the home, the messaging actually was spend less time doing these tasks, but spend more time working on your home. So now you have freed up hours to actually spend more time in the home doing more types of domestic labor. So it depends on actually how you interpret it and how you see that working. Because in some ways, you were getting more hours in the day, but in other ways, the push was you have more hours in the day now to make your home perfect. So there are other ways that technology saves us time, it saves us effort, but it also doesn't necessarily change the nature of what we're doing.
Can we talk about this spatial and skills mismatch that I know economists talk about all the time? Is there something that's happening in the economy, again, that's different as these jobs shift?
I think one of the things, and you brought up the issue of migration, is that migration is a lot more difficult. As Danielle had mentioned, that it's not easy to pick up and move. The other problem is that a lot of places where some of the new jobs are in very expensive places. And so you can't just pick up and move and then try to find a new job when the housing is going through the roof. And so the other problem is that you talk about that skills mismatch, is that the question is, well, what are the new skills? If you lose certain jobs, and then you move to a different job, do you have the same sort of skill set? And so one example, and especially the candidate Yang has talked about, is that with truck drivers, that's a very good...
Yeah, everybody's very worried about this whole idea of automated vehicles displacing these millions of truck drivers who are some of the highest paid, low education workers there are in the economy.
Right. And so a lot of them might get displaced, but the issue is that with autonomous vehicles, there's going to be a whole new industry, whole new set of jobs to be able to kind of service and monitor those autonomous vehicles. But then the question is, how well does those jobs pay? What is the job quality? And so I think what we need to talk about is, when we're talking about the shift in jobs, it's not about the aggregate job loss, but the quality of the new jobs that are created from that.
And people are also worried about, Gbenga, people are worried about what's going to happen to men in this economy, because a lot of the jobs that are going to be lost will be jobs that traditionally men had, like in mechanical things, training, business services, and mechanical things of office support. But the jobs that are being increasing are going to be jobs that have been in the service sector, have been traditionally women-populated jobs, like in healthcare and in business legal things and education. And then also Black and Hispanic workers who tend to have less education and tend to be in more manual, repetitive labor instances. So how is this going to impact women, or how's it going to impact on gender, and what's going to be the impact with race?
So you listed men, and you also listed people of color, Black and Hispanics, but the list actually goes on. So you think about younger workers, new workers, you think about geographic, so rural communities. So there's going to be actually a lot of people who are exposed to automation. And so what we need to do is really rethink our kind of like workforce design and create a kind of system that is very inclusive, that also, and it's not just about upskilling, but it's like, what is the right type of skills, and kind of putting money behind that and real federal investment. But it's very important, as you bring up a good point, is that we need to think about who is going to be impacted and how they're going to be impacted, and then what are the steps that we need to take to actually make them help out with the future of work.
So Danielle, as we close out here, this idea of the future of work and what it means, particularly for women and people of color, anything that you guys have looked at or you think about, as we make this transition that will have an impact on these communities?
So I think traditionally the types of labor that we've been, as a society, and as an American society, most fearful of losing are labors that are coded as white working class male jobs. So when we see manufacturing jobs disappear, when we see automotive jobs disappear, coal mining jobs disappear, we get this ongoing fear that somehow we're going to lose something that's indicative not only of the type of labor we do, but also of our American identity. But as you mentioned, there are other people who will be impacted by the loss of jobs or by the shifting job labor force. So I think that sometimes we need to open up the conversation to see exactly who's going to be impacted, because the types of jobs that people are fearful of losing now are jobs that are occupied by people across the spectrum. So it's not just truck drivers who would lose their job to, say, automated cars. It's also other folks who have either stable jobs or minimum wage paying jobs that would also be at risk. And that is also something that impacts people across the board, across race and across gender. So I think we need to think more broadly about who gets held up as indicative of the American labor force, because in some ways the case study of Teamsters being potentially at risk kind of follows that same historical pattern of being concerned primarily with white working class male jobs being lost. But as you mentioned, it'll be everyone who's impacted. Okay, and one more thing before I let you go, because I thought I was going to go, but I do want to get to this. Some of the ideas about how we make this better that have come up. Obviously, Andrew Yang has been talking a lot about this universal basic income. You've got people like Elizabeth Warren, who's talking about wealth taxes. But then there are these other ideas that have popped up, like personal benefit accounts, that people can use portable benefit accounts as people move into the gig economy. They can take their benefits from one place to the next without having to start new accounts. Obviously, education has also been a factor that people have recognized. Let's just go to UBI. The question on UBI is, can we afford it? And is this the kind of thing that you think America could work? $12,000 a year, 254 million American adults, basically. It's about a $3 trillion price tag. Danielle, before we go, do you think this is something that America could get into? Well, I would like to defer to economists on this one, because historical precedent for something that widespread. Obviously, there have been other instances where select communities have had, like, united funds that everyone who's a member of that community would be able to get money from. The most common example that I could think of for U.S. history or for U.S. political purposes would be Native American groups who have similar arrangements where if you're a member, a recognized member of that group, you could get dividends or money from the group as part of that, but that's on a much smaller scale. And obviously it's very selective, and there's lots of ways that these groups self-regulate to who would actually receive this money when they come of age.
Great, thank you. So, Gbenga, UBI, what do you think? Can we afford it?
So I think we can afford it. And the way to think about it, and I always kind of hesitated when we talk about can we afford things, because it looks at just one side of the ledger. So we think about people who can't afford emergency. So you have a flat tire. What do you do? And that impacts work. So can that individual afford that? No. So when you have UBI, something like $1,000 a month, that's going to be able to help a couple of those emergency experiences. And so that is going to help people out, ease their burden. One of my concerns about the program that, as Yang talks about, he talks about the UBI instead of SNAP, Medicaid, TANF, those programs. Mm-hmm. And that's where it's concerning, because these programs really help out with the burden. So, SNAP, TANF puts food on the table. You think about people have emergency medical care. So you have Medicaid. And so when you take away those programs and then just replace it with $1,000 a month, that's not going to be able to take care of those. So UBI, on top of those programs, existing programs that help ease the burden, might be helpful for those emergency spending and emergency events. But instead of, I don't think it works.